Good morning, and thank you for joining us to discuss UHRP's recently issued report, Islam Dispossessed, China's Persecution of Uyghur Imams and Religious Figures. Joining us for our discussion are Peter Irwin, UHRP Senior Program Officer and author of the report, Abduali Ayub, Uyghur language activist and writer, Joanne Smith Finley, reader in Chinese studies at Newcastle University. And we will begin with opening remarks from UHRP Executive Director Omer Kanat and Abdul Malik Mujahid, founder of Justice for All. UHRP jointly issued this report with Justice for All, and we thank them for their contributions and support. Omer?
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining this discussion of UHRP's important new report on the targeting of the Uyghur Imams. This is the latest in a series of UHRP reports documenting the Chinese government's systematic targeting of Uyghur elite, people who have an important role in maintaining Uyghur identity and Uyghur society in our homeland, East Turkistan. UHRP previously issued 3 reports documenting hundreds of cases of disappearances and imprisonment of Uyghur intellectuals who have a critical role in preserving, in advancing of Uyghurs' understanding of our history and our culture. The targeting of imams as spiritual leaders of the Uyghur community is part of the terrible scheme intended to end the transmission of a foundational part of Uyghur identity to the next generation. Of course, the targeting of religious leaders in East Turkestan has happened frequently under the CCP rule, but what's happening now is unprecedented in scope and scale in living memory. With the help of Abduali Ayub, UHRP was able to document 1,046 cases of detention, imprisonment, or death of Uyghur and other Turkic Imams. The true number is likely much higher. This report only scratches the surface of persecution. The report was released on Eid al-Fitr, normally a time of celebration for Uyghurs. For years, Uyghurs have been prevented from practicing their faith, but this year, to produce a show for international audiences, the Chinese propaganda apparatus forced Uyghurs to dance in the square of Idgah in Kashgar city and showed it on state television. Later reporting confirmed that the people were forced to be there. They had been required to practice even the day before. These propaganda efforts are unconvincing, but there is still a massive gap in understanding of what is really happening to the Uyghurs, especially in the Muslim world. We hope our report will serve as a foundation for advocacy among Muslim communities around the world. Governments and the people need to know how China treats Islam and what this means to them. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Omar Kanat, for your leadership. And thank you, Peter, for writing this report, and you for your collaboration there. Justice for All is very happy to collaborate with UHRP. We were established 20 years ago. It's a human rights organization which has worked on 10, 12 different issues over a period of time, currently working on 6 issues. Among them is Save Uyghur campaign, in which we collaborate and participate and fund UHRP. Unfortunately, Muslim world is not quite aware of the way Chinese do their propaganda. Recently, a delegation found copies of the Quran in their hotel room, and they thought, oh, Even in my country, copy of Quran is not found in a hotel room. Similarly, they tried to fake it when I was visiting Eastern Turkistan. But I have seen from my own eyes how imams and religious people are treated. One of them was arrested actually while talking with me. Although most of when you think of imam, you think of men, but women leaders have also been subjected to horrible treatment. I know of a female Quran teacher whose father and three brothers all were Quran teachers. And she was detained, she was tortured, she was raped to the level that multiple times she miscarried. And this was not in the current situation. Current situation is far more horrible. It has been happening throughout the period. And Muslims in Eastern Turkestan have found ingenious ways of keeping their faith alive. And not, very much like Uzbekistan and other places under the Soviet Union before they became free, Muslims home to home will maintain a teaching network in which children will come home, or a hafiz or the imam will visit their home and teach them to keep Islam alive. And I have seen that in Eastern Turkestan since the 70s. I'm aware of people doing that. I have met many of them outside as well as inside. So this is an amazing method which they have adopted. But when I was reading this report, I realized the cost of that. All of that is called illegal activity, required by faith, but illegal in the eyes of every little communist here and there. You don't see consistent behavior throughout, so it's not part of the law. In some places, they treat them worse than the other places. And so it seems that little tyrant and a little dictator of the Communist Party can dictate what they like to do. So I'm very happy and pleased with the work of UHRP to develop this report, as well as earlier report about mosques as well. I hope we will get it translated in Arabic and other languages of Muslim majority, and they will realize this is not artifact of American mind, but these type of religious discrimination operation, which reaches the level of genocide. And Justice for All for 3 years have been considering it a genocide. I'm glad now this word is more acceptable word. So thank you so much, Omar Kanat, for your leadership. And thank you, UHRP. And thank you, Peter. I know it takes a lot of time to organize the data and present when you do not have direct access to those locations. And as far as that fake Eid is concerned, Omar Kanat, you'll be happy to know that I have developed a 3-minute video, which will be pretty soon out, which deciphers how they created the fake Eid. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for those remarks. If we could now turn to Peter Irwin to give us a brief overview of the report.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nicole, and thanks to Omar and Malik as well for those comments. I think, as Malik mentioned, I mean, the issue has been, I mean, there's been restrictions on religion and imams for a long time. And what we've seen over the past 2 or 3 years in particular is just basically an intensification of those policies, essentially. Just to take you through the report itself, so it took a number of months to put this together, and for a couple of reasons. Firstly was the compilation of the data set. And I want to note that, of course, the compilation of the data set would not, of course, be possible without 3 primary sources, one being, of course, Abduwali Ayub and all of his work on the ground in places like Turkey and elsewhere, speaking to Uyghurs constantly and compiling this information from family members, from friends who have people detained. So him, of course, I would thank first. Secondly is the Uyghur, the Uyghur Transitional Justice Database based in Norway. The team there has also been compiling cases of Uyghurs detained or imprisoned. And then thirdly is the Xinjiang database, Xinjiang Victims Database. I know Jean Bunin, for example, and his staff there have been, again, tremendously important for documenting these cases. So what we were essentially able to do is look through the cases and find those who are detained, who are either imams, religious figures, Bui, for example, who are female women, Uyghur religious figures as well. And what we essentially came up with was about 1,000 cases, just over 1,000. And Omar has also mentioned that, yes, we had 1,000 cases, but most likely the number is significantly higher. These are simply the cases we were able to find and have some kind of corroborating information coming from people overseas in particular. So about 1,000 cases. These are mostly male Uyghur religious figures. I think there is a bit of a bias towards Uyghur males, for example, because often Uyghur women are not seen necessarily as imams, but they certainly take up roles in the religious community as well. But they may not have been counted in this data set or counted in the compilation of cases. So the number of women is most likely much higher as well. I think the most important thing in terms of the data set was that 40% of the cases were in which there was information on this, 40% were sentenced to prison terms. It was very high. It's about 300 cases we documented. And if you go a little bit deeper into the data set on prison sentences, of those who were sentenced or convicted to prison terms, 96% were sentenced to 5 or more years in prison, and about 25% were sentenced to 20 years or more. So when Uyghur imams and religious figures are targeted, they're targeted for long prison sentences. And often for prison sentences, not simply detention in camps, or there are some cases where we found that they're now under house arrest. 18 of the cases we found that these figures had died in detention or shortly after detention. One key piece of information too is that the age. I mean, there were a number of cases of imams and religious figures who were detained over 70 years old. A couple cases, 2 in particular, over 90 years old. So I think that gives you a sense of sort of the role of the government and what they're trying to do. It's not so very sensible necessarily to be detaining people, obviously, but over 90 years old seems a bit ridiculous and just simply punitive for being a religious figure over time. A couple other things about the data as well is that we found that if you look more carefully at the information coming in, a lot of the sentences were for imams and religious figures who had been approved by the government. I mean, they had been approved officially by the government throughout the 90s and 2000s. They were sentenced afterwards anyway. There are a lot of cases of people who are retroactively sentenced for things that took place 10 years ago. I mean, I know there was a case of a person who was praying in a group a decade before, and they were detained and sentenced to prison, for example. So these are the kinds of things that people are being sentenced for. More specifically, in terms of the supposed sentences, illegal teaching, illegal preaching, teaching religion to children was a big one as well, and that has to do with the way in which the government sees basically the relationship between parents and their children, the generational transmission of knowledge, communication or travel abroad. Again, this goes for all Uyghurs in general who are traveling or communicating abroad, not just for imams, but the sentences are much more severe. Right, in a couple individual cases to pull out, I mean, a 10-year sentence for praying in a group and reciting scripture, a 20-year sentence for refusing to hand in his Quran to be burned. This should give you a sense of, and these are not isolated incidents, right? This is happening across the data set with a number of these cases. It gives you a sense of what the Chinese government sees as illegal religious behavior or activity. So in addition to the data set itself and what that tells you about the government's campaign over the past few years, we also look sort of putting this in context with some of the other religious restrictions. For example, obviously, Islam in general for a lot of Uyghurs is foundational to the Uyghur identity. They prohibited teaching religion at all education levels, right? So children cannot receive a religious education at all under 18. They banned long beards for Uyghur men, headscarves for Uyghur women. They instituted an anti-halal campaign to prevent the labeling of food and other products as halal. They criminalized Hajj pilgrimages without government approval or pre-approval for sentences or for travel. One important note here is that a lot of the people, several people in the data set were sentenced for unauthorized Hajj pilgrimages. So if you don't register with the government, you can't go and you can be sentenced for a number of years in prison. They've adopted legislation basically broadly defining quotidian religious practices and activities as illegal, essentially, as extremists. This is in Chinese government legislation. The UN group of independent experts urged that this regulation, the regulation on de-extremification, to be repealed in its entirety. And they don't often do that. These independent experts are usually much more cautious. They said, you need to repeal this whole piece of legislation because it is so counter to international law. So again, more broadly speaking, what we're talking about and what we found in the findings is that China essentially is attempting to halt the intergenerational transmission of religious knowledge for Uyghurs. They're trying to stop religious knowledge from being passed from one generation to the next. At this point, the only venue in which Uyghur religious practice is legal is the state-sponsored mosque. And by the way, thousands of those mosques and places of worship have been destroyed over the past 3 or 4 years. This has been documented by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and by UHRP, destruction of mosques. Right, so the only venue for Uyghurs is the state-sponsored mosque, state-approved mosque, the ones that are remaining, sermons by state-approved imams. So basically what you're doing is you're, at the same time as detaining the imams themselves, you're also restricting the space in which they're able to practice. If you're only legally able to practice in the mosque itself, practice outside in your home, for example, is basically now illegal. And again, also more contextually, and we'll get into more details about this, we tried also with the report essentially to trace these policies over time. You sort of see over the centuries as well, sort of this ebb and flow of, you know, mild accommodation, and then it sort of moves closer, for example, in the Cultural Revolution into more repression. In the 1980s, you see a bit of an opening up. There's some mosques that are able to be built, but by the 1990s, this sort of closes again. And you see this, we try to trace this from the 1980s. I'll leave it there. I think that's a reasonably succinct overview of the report itself. It would be good, of course, to get some background from the other speakers, and yeah, I'll let Nicole take it from there.
Thank you so much. Now I'd like to turn to Abduali Ayub. He's done very important work in documenting and collecting these cases. I wanted to ask him if he could describe for us the process by which he obtained the information and verified it.
Thank you, Nicole. First of all, I used the government websites for that. Those imams are working for the government departments. For example, that like Abdul Qadir Sawat, the vice president of Xinjiang Islamic Association. He was the vice president of the, like in East Turkistan, Islamic Association is the government department, and they have websites. And I got the information from the inside of Uyghur Homeland, and then I searched online, and then I found out that the information about Abdul Qadir Sawat deleted. And depending on this, I searched the different Islamic Association. For example, we have Islamic Association in every different cities. And like I searched Islamic Association in Aksu, I searched Islamic Association in Kashgar, I searched Islamic Association in Hotan, and then found out that some of the imams' information deleted. And then I interviewed the people in Istanbul and their relatives and their friends in Istanbul, and they said that they already got detained. And second, we received the document from China and the Karkash list, and the Karkash list mentioned that some Uyghur imams got arrested because of their religious activity. For example, that president of Karkash Islamic Association, Abla Jambekri, he got detained and arrested and sentenced 20 years. And it's mentioned in Karkash list. And another source that Aksu list published by Human Rights Watch, it also mentioned some imams, and I interviewed their family members and their friends outside, and they told me that those arrests and some of them already sentenced. Number of I enlisted to about 630 about that, and it's our source is government websites and leaked documents and face-to-face interview in we did in Istanbul.
Yes, thank you very much. It's become increasingly difficult to get information out of the region. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the challenges in accessing information, and how has this changed over time?
In 2017 and 2018, it's a little bit easier to get information. and people, I think the people wants to tell at that time, and but after the 2019, it's hard. For example, if even we found out some names, for example, that when Karkash list leaked, and it's really hard to confirm. For example, that Karkash list mentioned that Mentimen Karem, he sentenced 6 years, and he already like 90 years old. And I wanna confirm this through the relatives and friends in Istanbul, but nobody wants to talk about him, because of so many people got arrested and they afraid if they talk, it will be dangerous to their family members. It's a big challenge for us. Like after we receive information, after we found information online or from the people, and we need to verify it through their friends and family members and the followers in Istanbul or in other Uyghur diaspora. But the problem is they don't want to talk, and they thought that if they talk about them, it will be more pressure on them, more torture, or more like devastating for their like cases. So that they, most of them, I can say that choose being silence. So like we, this report we enlisted more than 1,000, but I think it's much more than that. But the problem is we have some cases identified, unverified, because of the people keep silence and they extremely afraid of being identified, extremely afraid of like they had like much more worse treatment inside in China if they talk, if they like mention these names. That's the big challenge.
Thank you. Yes, it is increasingly difficult to get information out, but certainly not impossible. Before we move on to our Joanne Smith-Finley, I'd like to remind the audience that you can submit questions. There will be a Q&A at the end. You can submit them through Facebook or YouTube, whatever platform you're watching on. Now I'd like to turn to Joanne Smith-Finley, who's a lecturer in China Studies at Newcastle University. You've done a lot of work on Uyghur society and specifically looking at Uyghur religious practice. Prominent figures in Uyghur society began to see mounting restrictions on their activity beginning in the 1990s. What do you think is the impetus of this change by the government, and why did they suddenly take an interest in religious figures in particular?
I think there were a combination of factors. First of all, you had the sort of general unrest across the country. So the 1989 pro-democracy demonstrations in Tiananmen, which obviously unnerved the government in a broader sense. Within Xinjiang, the region, within the Uyghur region itself, you had the Bahrain demonstrations against religious restrictions in 1990 in Kashgar, which of course the state characterized as an insurrection, an armed insurrection. There are differing stories from each side about what actually happened in Bahrain, but we can agree that, you know, after that happened, the restrictions were hugely ratcheted up and became much heavier. And then the other thing, of course, that happened in 1991 was the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the appearance of independent Muslim states across the border, so Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, etc. And what we began to see as the religious restrictions increased across the 1990s, having been relatively relaxed in the 1980s, and it's not a coincidence that we see a lot less unrest and a lot less dissatisfaction in the 1980s. Across the 1990s, we see restrictions being ratcheted up, local people becoming more and more dissatisfied with what they see as Han Chinese disrespect for their customs and practices, restrictions on their religion. At the same time, they see their cousins across the border managing their own affairs in independent states, and increasingly, especially young men, young Uyghur men begin to start thinking about and dreaming about independence and whether we can actually be independent. And this would be a way in which we could manage our own affairs and we could practice our religion freely. So it was a combination of all of these factors, I think.
Many of the imams featured in the report spoke of the ways in which they would resist state-imposed restrictions on imams. Can you tell us about your experience in speaking to Uyghurs who tried to resist government policies?
Yes, of course. I didn't personally interview any imams during any of my field trips, but I did interview a lot of people in the broader population about the Islamic revival. This was in the 2000s when the Islamic revival there was really picking up. And I think I was interested to read in Peter's report, though, about the imam who talked about using coded language in his sermons, because this really resonated with me in a different way. It resonated with my own work on Uyghur folk singers, dutar players, so Ömer Can Alim and Abdurrahim Hayat, who also used a lot of metaphor and allegory and a lot of coded language in their political folk songs during the 1990s. And they were able to communicate messages to the broader population orally, so they could reach people who weren't literate as well in the villages. And they were able to sort of communicate different messages about colonizers and also about collaborators. And some of these songs actually were referring to imams who were seen to collaborate with the Chinese state too closely. And of course, it's no coincidence that at the exact time that Ömer Can Alim's cassette tape Kaldi is the sort of main hit soundtrack in the Uyghur Bazaar in 95, 96, that we have this attack on this imam in Kashgar, where the imam has his ear sliced off, I believe. And this is said to have been a warning. I heard stories about this while I was in the Uyghur region doing my field work at that time. This was intended to be a warning because his relationship with the authorities was seen to be much too close. So this coded language is very interesting. This was happening in a number of realms very successfully across the 1990s and into the 2000s, right up until about 2004. When the authorities began to pay greater attention to what they called the cultural sphere. In terms of the broader population, yes, it was amazing. In 2002 and 2004, particularly by 2004, we were suddenly seeing huge numbers going into the mosques in Urumqi, and the mosques had been rebuilt. They were much larger. The forecourts were much larger. Huge numbers of people going in. Of all ages. The only age that was slightly absent, I would say, were the ones who were born in who went through the Cultural Revolution. Sort of middle-aged men weren't really there, but the older men were there, men in their 20s and 30s were there, and also some teenagers were going in at the time and still able to go in at that time. And I interviewed sixth form students, young men, sixth form students who grinned and talked about how they would slip out of school at lunchtime and they would borrow someone who was over 18. They would borrow their identity card and they would use that identity card to slip into the mosque and to pray. And they talked about how their classmates would put gentle pressure on them, and say, look, you need to be a better Muslim. You need to go into the mosque. And they would talk about how going into the mosque and wearing a snowy white dopa and coming back out, they would feel really glad to be part of that community, and they would feel really fulfilled. But all of this, of course, was happening under the radar. This was happening secretly, and it could still happen secretly at this time because this was before the current era of ubiquitous camera surveillance.
Yeah,
Yes,
maybe just follow up on that. I mean, just to give a brief overview of some of the resistance that we saw, at least from what we heard from the imams themselves, that it took place in a number of levels. For example, there were courses, we refer to some of the courses that were forced upon the imams. So a lot of the imams were forced to go to Urumqi, or the capital of the region, to take these courses in which they are essentially indoctrinated to say, this is the way in which you must teach, this is the way in which you must lead your congregation. And we asked the people, we asked these imams overseas, we said, like, look, what kind of impact did this actually make? And these courses began in the 1990s, and they continued all through the 2000s. Every year or so, people would come in and out. And when we asked them directly, what do you think the influence was? What do you think the impact of these courses was? And they would say, look, we sat in the room and we wrote things down and we nodded our heads, and then we went back to our hometown and we did the same thing, right? So there was resistance there because no one was really holding them to necessarily exactly what they're saying in the mosques. I think maybe the Chinese officials thought if they put them through these courses that they would take notes and they would change the behavior. Of course, obviously, religion in Islam for Uyghurs is deeply ingrained. For a lot of different people it is. So that was one way in which I think the government tried to do it. And you see that the way in which the government changed its policies through the 2000s, because I think there was a frustration that from the government officials that this just wasn't getting through to them. They weren't taking these courses and reforming and becoming so-called good Muslims or good Uyghurs. But in some ways, this really changed the way, over the years, maybe perhaps post 9/11, it changed the way that Islam was practiced. So you have, for example, pre-written sermons. The government essentially started to write the sermons for them, for the people who came to the mosque, or to the point where the imam would have to basically hand in the sermon that they were going to give, and they would give it to the official. The official would mark it up and say, look, you can't say this, you can't say that. For the most part, I think they probably got the message. Sorry, there's a siren behind me. But there were several other venues in which Uyghurs were able to practice a little bit. For example, other places other than the mosque became an attractive place in which you could preach. So, for example, during marriage ceremonies, there's a little bit of space there. During other cultural events, Darren Byler's done work on this, where he spoke to Uyghurs around Urumqi a number of years ago, where they found that rather than Islam being sort of preached inside the mosque, what would happen is sort of on the outskirts, they would leave the mosque and they would speak together about these issues elsewhere where they're not so tightly controlled, where there wasn't a minder or an official sitting in the or standing in the congregation amongst them. You also, I know Dr. Rachel Harris and Aziz Issa did some work on this as well. So how actually Islam was pushed onto online. So post 9/11 especially too, is that Uyghurs are able to practice on, they have an article I think called Islam by Smartphone, where there's resistance, sort of passive resistance, in which Uyghurs are able to find new areas to resist and to continue. This is just sort of the nature of people. I think if you're going to restrict them in one space, they're going to go somewhere else. Other ways in which imams, at one point, children would go to an imam's home to learn from the imam or the religious figure, or Uyghur women would be the ones who would instruct them. What it sort of flipped in the late 90s, early 2000s, where actually what would end up happening is that the imam would go to the homes of individual families, right? And they sort of disguise it as a visit, and they would pray and they would preach and they would teach religion there. Again, it's about sort of these controls. The Chinese government's sort of trying to play whack-a-mole a little bit and try to pick up some of the things that they're doing and discover the ways in which the imams are still preaching a religion and is still able to persist, essentially. But I think that really changed 3 years ago or 4 years ago when they said, look, we've had enough. The second generation nationalities policy, where we're just going to restrict it completely, is that it will only be a shell of its former self. Or perhaps as I believe Malik or Omar mentioned during Eid this year, is that they force people out into the square to dance. And that's basically what Islam has become in the region. It's hard to tell if there is still resistance. Again, I would presume that there's resistance maybe in people's homes still, but again, given the ubiquity of cameras, given the ubiquity of these Chinese government minders and the cadres who are going to live with families, it becomes even more difficult. So that's sort of where we are today, I think, in terms of the resistance that we're seeing.
Yes, thank you so much, Peter. You and Joanne both alluded to the technology that's in use. And I think now in mosques, they do have camera systems which pipe the video and audio to the police so they can monitor in real time what's being said in the mosques, if the imams are staying on the official script or not. And they're much more strict about entry and exit of people who are permitted in the mosques, that sort of thing. So it's the space is certainly tightening quite a bit. To go back to Joanne Smith Finley, I was wondering if you could comment on your quote that is from one of your books that says, Uyghurs found themselves increasingly confronted with a bipolar world in which they could resist and face marginalization or accommodate to ensure survival. I was wondering if you could tell us what you mean by that, and if you have seen anything changing in recent years.
Sure. I think this was it was kind of like a fork in the road that many Uyghurs faced after 1997. I think in particular after the Hulja demonstration, the Hulja protest, which occurred in reaction to the arrest of religious students. And that demonstration was put down very harshly by the state. 10% of men in Hulja disappeared after it. I was in Hulja in 2002 interviewing people about that event, and the general agreement across that city was that around 10% of menfolk had simply disappeared in one way or another after that event. And there was a huge crackdown. And I think after that, all of the hope that had been there before 1997 for possible independence, you know, a la Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, all of that collapsed. It was like a huge anticlimax. I describe it in that way in my book. So there was this sort of building up of hope towards 1997, and then after 1997, it crashed. And the first time I went back after 1997, there was a real silence, and people just weren't talking in the way that they had been talking before. It was a lot harder to get people to speak. There was a definite increase in fear and tension in the environment. And I think at this point, people began to realize that they had a choice, you know, and if they were going to carry on clinging very strongly to Uyghur piety and Uyghur religious practice, that they were going to have to go underground to do that they would have to do so outside of the state structures. So, for example, from the 2000s onwards, a lot of Uyghur men went into business and did independent business and set up independent businesses, because that was one way in which they could carry on going to the mosque, could carry on with their religious practice without being sanctioned by the state. Because if you worked for the state, you couldn't, you weren't allowed to practice religion. If you were a state employee or a government employee, you weren't allowed to practice religion. So at that point, a lot of Uyghurs went independent, if you like, DIY. They did business by themselves independently, and increasingly they did business cross-border with Turkey and the Central Asian states. And you could see this reflected in the environment in Urumqi. You know, a lot of Turkic businesses and businessmen, a lot of Turkish goods and a lot of Central Asian goods. And this was one way in which you could keep your religion and sort of stay safe, but you were excluded and marginalized from the state economy, the state-led economy. Yeah, but this was a path that a lot of people were happy to take. The other path at that time was to go to a Chinese medium school, get really good at speaking Chinese, and try to integrate into the system. But that became harder and harder and harder. After 1997, Uyghurs were distrusted by the state more and more. And then again, after 2009, of course, that was increased tenfold. It became harder and harder to integrate, even if you were Chinese speaking, even if you were fluent in Chinese. So, yeah, so there was this fork in the road. And I think where we are today, there is no choice anymore, is there? Now, where we are today since 2017 is very much a case of assimilate, become loyal, tell the story in the way the Chinese state wants you to tell it, live your life in a way that does not threaten the state or the party, or we will eradicate you. Yeah, So I think the Uyghur identity now has become an existential threat to the state, it's also characterized as a biological threat to the state, as Sean Roberts has characterized it as well. Yeah.
If I can just say a couple words on that too, it'd be good, of course, to hear, I think, Abduwali's take on this, but we actually did put this question to them, is that, to the imams who spoke to in the diaspora, is that we notice, and we try to trace back a few hundreds of years, briefly, of course, but just, again, to see the cyclical nature of repression and accommodation that goes back and forth. You have a bit of openness before Cultural Revolution, and of course it closes up, and then it opens up in the 80s. And we were trying to understand, well, is this simply just another cycle? And a lot of the imams we spoke to said, no, I think this seems like, it seems like something different this time. And these were people who actually grew up as children during the Cultural Revolution. They saw what happened, and they saw how bad it was then. And they said, this is something different. And objectively, from our perspective, it is something different, whereas, as was already mentioned, that there is a technological sophistication that, of course, didn't exist back then, where people are just simply not able to escape the power of the government at all anymore. So I think one story I can tell from one imam we spoke to is that he had buried Qurans, a Quran and a number of religious texts in a graveyard. I said, well, so, and he threw some in a river as well. He was in Hotan, and we asked him, well, why did you throw some in a river? Why did you bury some of them? It seems like if you bury something, there is sort of an expectation that perhaps you might unearth it one day, that you might actually take it up, because maybe there's an expectation that you can actually practice again. And he said, look, yeah, I buried it, but I buried it in the cemetery where my parents are buried, and that cemetery was destroyed. Right? The government just leveled the cemetery, so it's just gone. Same with his parents who were buried there. So I think that gives you a sense of why it's, I think, quite a bit different this time. But I would like maybe to hear from Abduwali how he sort of sees this, and how the cyclical nature of this persecution has changed over time, like how Abduwali might think about this in terms of the relationship to the government.
Before I left China, I met with Abdul Ayub. He is more than 90 years old. He's sentenced, and he's in Artush right now. And he told me that he experienced the first mass arrest happened in 1957, and the second time is it's in 1966. And he told me that, at that time, imam targeted, but not all of the imams. At that time, those imam who targeted are some of them related to the resistance in 1930, the Republic, and it's in 1944, it's Second Republic. And but he told me that this time, because I visited him in 2015, he told me that this time it's totally different. This time is all of the entire nation, entire Uyghur ethnicity is under threat. And he told me that this, his exact word is, this is black and white change. He said that this change, this time, this change is 100%. It's just upside down. And there is no room to keep our identity and keep our culture in this situation. And that's why at that time, so many Uyghur sent their kids to Turkey and Egypt. And I visited Egypt in 2016 May. I found that more than 5,000 Uyghur students who are studying in Al-Azhar University and different universities in Egypt. And I have seen other Uyghur students in Turkey, and even I know that some of them are studying in UAE. It means that in 2014, it started this mass arrest, and this Uyghur are under threat, and some of them feel under threat that they sent their kids to their Turkey, and especially Turkey and Egypt. And in 2016, I think it's in September, those students in Turkey and like Egypt, they asked to back, and their parents persecuted. And that's the like main. It's the first they start those people who sent their kids to outside, and it means that people want to avoid this persecution, but at the end, like because of they are under pressure, they have to ask their kids to back, and then they like parents and their family members and also their kids in Egypt and Turkey also the persecuted. And I know that like one, his name is Vab, he sentenced 20 years after he stayed in Egypt for a while. After he back, he sentenced. And then it's not only the students who are in like Egypt and Turkey, and some of the Uyghur students who are in the United States and other European countries also asked to back. And for example, that my niece asked to back to China, and she died in detention center last year in December 20th. That like people tried to save their kids, but at the end they couldn't because of they are under pressure, and because of this, and the kids come back, and then both of them are like persecuted.
Thank you very much for those comments. Peter, could you talk to us a bit about some of the cases of prison sentences and what it tells us about the Chinese government's changing approach?
Sure, thanks. I think it does give you a sense of it. I mean, I touched on this briefly, but you see when I say charges, they're really alleged charges. These aren't charges recognized under any law anywhere except for China, really. For the most part, it's simply for a lot of the cases that came to the databases simply said for being an imam, right? So that gives you a sense of what you can be basically charged on. Religious affiliation in general. The Caracas document told us a lot about sort of these circles of the three circles of I guess relationships with people. So if you have a relationship with a family, or you're part of a religious family, this puts you on notice already. So in the 1990s, for example, there were children who the government identified as children who might be taught from their parents, for example, and they would actually intercept them very early on, and they would take them to the courses, and they would tell their parents, look, we think that perhaps you might want to teach your child that your child might become an imam one day. So they were in there very early on in the process. And that also has very much to do with another significant charge, or one of the charges that came out disproportionately or in large numbers, was teaching religion to children. I think that tells you something very serious in particular, and it tells you something about why they're doing it. Is that they want to halt the intergenerational transmission of religious knowledge. If you have policies that essentially bar or prohibit children from learning, or from teachers to teach the religion to the children, you're essentially cutting off this entire generation. They're doing it in one single generation, essentially. So what you have on the one hand is you have detentions of older people, so primarily between those who were born between 1960 and 1980, but again, also people who are like Abedin Ayub, for example, or other people who are detained over 90 years old or over 70 years old. And on the other hand, you have people who are being detained who are teaching religion to children, who are trying to. So again, I think government is trying to make very clear that you're going to go to prison if you basically teach your child any kind of religious practice or do it with them. And again, in the context that we speak in terms of what's happening in East Turkistan today, you have surveillance cameras, you have this IJOP network, you have basically a surveillance system in which also children who are essentially being encouraged to tell the authorities what their parents are doing in their homes, for example. I remember there's a case a couple of years ago from Radio Free Asia which said that children were given questionnaires about their parents' activities and said, does your mother or father pray at home? Things like this. So it's pretty pernicious, I think. So that's another fairly significant category, is teaching religion to children. But again, some of the more ridiculous charges, like simply just for traveling abroad or communicating abroad, again, family relations, Officiating a wedding, this was one of the charges in a number of cases. Officiating weddings or funerals, again, you can go to prison. And again, that has to do with the way they're trying to close up these spaces. As I mentioned, in terms of resistance, Uyghurs were able to practice, again, if you can't do it at the mosque, you're going to do it at other venues where people are gathered, and they might be weddings or funerals, right? So people are being sentenced there. Vague charges for illegal teaching and preaching. It's not exactly clear what that means, but I think most likely it's teaching outside of the state-controlled mosque. Religious study abroad, studying religion in general. Of course, other vague charges for separatism and extremism, but we have a good sense of what extremism means in the Chinese government's eyes. It's not extremism as you would think of outside of China. So I think this is sort of a taste of them. Now, there are individual cases which we documented as well. There's a 7-year sentence for sending a child to Egypt to study, and we know that there was a roundup of students from Al-Azhar University and forced back to China. 10-year sentence for praying in a group, 10-year sentence for distributing scripture, for example, on memory cards. This is one big thing too, is the possession or distribution of illegal religious materials. And that's simply just having a Quran, for example, in electronic form or having texts. 14 or 15 years sentence for watching a disc with religious extremist content. Again, because the definition of extremism is so broad, simply it could just be a recitation of scripture on a DVD, for example, that can get you in prison for 10 or 15 years. A 17-year sentence for teaching others to pray. A 20-year sentence for studying for 6 months in Egypt. Again, you come back to China, in which the government actually encouraged people to leave the country at certain stages in history, and then they come back and they're basically sentenced. Again, as I mentioned before, a 20-year sentence for refusing to hand in a Quran to be burned. Yeah, so this sort of gives you a flavor of what's going on. These are more individual cases that we have information on. Broadly speaking, it's about simply your religious affiliation or teaching religion to children or illegal preaching outside of the mosque setting.
Is there a sense from the data of whether people are being sent to prison after being sent to the detention camps, or if they're being sent directly to prison? It's become increasingly obvious that people who were in the camps are increasingly being sent to prison, given absurdly long sentences when they'd been sent to the camps originally because they had done things that didn't rise to the level of a crime. And there are reports of mass trials, that sort of thing. Is there a sense that these are people who were in the camps originally, or are they simply being sent directly to the prisons?
So the data itself is a little bit unclear on this. One thing you can take from it is that I think what the data indicate is that between 2014 and 2016, really before the mass detention of Uyghurs and Kazakhs and others started, is that between 2014 and 2016, there was a number of Uyghurs who were sentenced to prison. Right. So there was a big spike, of course, in 2017, 2018. But again, if the sentences were happening really between 2014 and 2016, this means that the government was not wasting their time sending them to a detention camp, a concentration camp, however you want to phrase it. They were sending them to prison really prior to this. Because I think it's an easy thing to do. It's maybe a little bit harder. It takes some time to build these facilities to detain people. But you already have prisons there. And again, when the new party secretary comes into power, and you have these second-generation nationalities policies coming into play, I think you can simply just sentence people and send them to prison. I think the data does show that. In terms of being sent from the camps to prisons, I think there is information that I've seen elsewhere on this. The data itself does not necessarily bear this out, but I think we can assume that's most likely the case. I'm not sure, maybe Omar or Abdueli or anybody else has some insight on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, since 2014 March till 2016 September, most of them sent to detention center, and then from detention center and the prison. And after the September 2016 until 2018 until now, most of them sent to the re-education camp first, and then from the camp they sent to the prison, or they sent to the camp. I think this is the there is no very clear definition between like the camp and detention center, and but the prison is it's different. But there is like not very like clear between detention center and the re-education camp, because some of the detention center, depending on the research, some of the detention center already changed it to re-education camp. And some of the re-education camp, we call it re-education camp, but after we like search, it's actually the detention center. So this is not very clear.
I think there has been an article by Jean Bunin in which he talks about some internees who have been kept in an internment camp for a certain amount of time, and who have been deemed to be incalcitrant, unrepentant to a certain degree, particularly where those people are heavily pious, heavily religious. Those people have been subjected to a kind of kangaroo court process within the internment camp, where with no official judicial process, and have then been sort of summarily sentenced to 10 or 20 years in prison via that route. And when I read this reminded me of something Ryan Sum said a while back, which is, what happens to the ones in the camps who refuse to be reformed? He said he was really worried and concerned about that portion of the internees. What happens to the ones who won't play the game? Who won't be reformed?
Yeah, actually, I want to add that, like, depending on our research, detention center is a little bit better than the re-education camp, because detention center, like detainees stay 12 hours, like sit 12 hours, and they don't have a course, they don't have homework, and they don't have like very strong indoctrination. But the re-education camp is worse than that, because it started in the morning at 6:30 and in the evening at 10 o'clock. The time is longer than the sitting time, longer than longer than detention center. And another that like indoctrination is more strong. That, for example, that like in detention center, there is no course, there is no homework, and there is no like so, for example, that in the re-education camp, like those detainees have to write 5 things, like 5 papers every day. But in detention center, there is no such requirement. And like in like re-education camp, they have teachers, and they have more questioning, more like questioning and answering this kind of process. And like psychologically, it's more torture. And detention center, comparatively, it's like food is worse than education camp, but the treatment and like this indoctrination and this torture is not very strong as like re-education, as detention center. Yeah.
Thank you for those comments.
Michael, yes, just I wanted to add something to what Abdulwali Ayub said about this prisoners and people who sentenced, for example. There are now, according to a new information that I received, there are thousands of people who have already been sentenced to long time imprisonment, but they are still being kept in these concentration camps. And because they are not being tried, of course, and just in just one day, for example, in a Maral Beshi, in a concentration camp in Maral Beshi, 400 people have been sentenced, to different terms, prison terms, but they are still being kept in that concentration camp. And according to this information, the people are not being tried. Just they are being sentenced even in their absence, and they convict. Officials come and just read the verdict. They call their names and they told them, oh, you have been sentenced to 20 years, sentenced to 10 years because of this activity, because of this your relation with the foreign country, because of their because in your iPhone or phone we found certain website that is not that is banned. So in China, so you had communication with foreign religious groups, and you participated in a certain religious ritual on religious ceremony years ago. So this is happening in these camps. So this there is. I heard that there is a difference between the trial of the intellectuals and also these people, ordinary people, farmers or businessmen and others. So at least in the intellectuals' term, they say they at least inform the family of intellectuals that he or she was sentenced to, for example, certain times of imprisonment. But for the families of these farmers, they even don't even inform their families. Their families are unaware what's happening to their loved ones in this concentration camps.
Yeah. I was wondering if you have any thoughts to add about the changes in policy and kind of the prospects for the future in terms of religious worship. We've spoken a bit about how there have been cycles of repression. What are the prospects for the future? Is there any possibility of the kind of resistance or secret practice that we've seen in the past?
Go ahead, Abdullah, first. Yeah.
Okay. From my observation, like Chinese government, for example, that Kashgar already like became a movie city. In China, there is a concept that movie city, Jiayingcheng. Movie city, it means that Chinese government keep some old cities with this original figure, and then ask some people to live there and practice their culture and practice their like everyday rituals. But the problem is, it means that just want to show the world that we have such group of people and they are practicing their culture. But the problem is, the goal is to attract the tourists. They are the people, like from the, if you visit their family and their mosques, they are the people. But in reality, they are the actors or actors, because the goal is keep that culture to attract the tourists and to show the world that, look, we are allowing people to have their culture alive, practicing their culture. And like TikTok video, recently I studied TikTok video, especially from the Kashgar, my hometown, and I found out that recently the new element that people in Eitka, they are practicing their Islam, they are practicing their praying. But the problem is that the tourists are gathering around them and seeing what are they doing. And it means that maybe maybe in the few years, China will teach some of the Uyghurs how to pray and how to get attention from the outside. And it means that Islam will be saved in Kashgar, but to show the world that we are keeping Islam alive in Kashgar and we are keeping the culture alive. The main reason is attract the tourists and to show the world that they cover the reality, to cover the Uyghur reality. because this before the Eid of Fitr, and we have seen that first young Uyghurs practiced how to dance in front of us, and then the second day we have a real Sama dance, and it is not only one scenario; it is the part of the big scenario actually. Maybe after if any delegation will go to Kashgar, they will see that people practicing Islam, for example, that this show also included their Xinjiang Islamic Institute. Xinjiang Islamic Institute, 90% of scholars, professors got arrested. I know their names and I enlisted in our list. And the problem is students still there. In Xinjiang Islamic Institute, still are learning Quran, and they are still there and they are having education. And that every time Islamic association or Islamic delegation visit China, they always show that Islamic Institute students, and look, we are educating them in Islam. And I think that the future is Chinese government still keep Islamic schools and still keep the mosques open and ask some of the people to go to study and ask some people to go to pray. Then the goal is just to attract tourist attention and to show the world that they allow the Uyghur to practice their Islam.
Yes, thank you for those comments. We have seen, in the past, for example, the Idka Mosque in Kashgar was turned into a major tourist attraction in the destroyed and rebuilt old town, and we're now seeing similar things happening in Hotan. I was wondering if Imam Malik could comment on this sort of thing. Does he think that this will be effective, these propaganda efforts in the Muslim world or in the outside world more broadly? You need to unmute your microphone.
Thank you. Unless a concentrated effort is in place for translating material from independent sources, people may still remain influenced by the communist propaganda. Whenever I put on my social media, I do find people who consider that to be quote unquote American propaganda. So this remains an issue. They will continue to fake this. I mean, they were faking it in front of me. I mean, somebody will stop me in the middle of the road while I'm crossing and will say something Islamic to me. Why in the world somebody in China will do that? Somebody sent him. So they have been used to orchestrating these type of efforts for a long period of time. For example, 1952 or 1956, there was a Bandung conference which happened in Bandung, Indonesia. Premier Chou En-lai announced that we have 50 million Muslims in China. Now, if you consider that to be a factual information, and you apply the Chinese growth rate until now, there should be more than 200 million Muslims in China. So they keep coming up with a strategy, one type or the other. So I think they will be successful in faking the freedom as they have been trying in the past, that the BBC and CNN will be allowed, then they will restrict where they can go, where they cannot go. So they have mastered this art. They will be able to control information. So it is up to us that how do we share with them the reality of the faith. I mean, as Ayub was saying, that they have a ongoing legitimate in their eyes of the communist training institution. I mean, the people who have been arrested, they were also more or less the product and approved by the Communist Party. Today they're in prison. Now there is a new crop coming in. Anytime they move away from a line, they will be persecuted. So yes, China is master of that. I mean, in Pakistan, for example, their PR person in their consulate, he was using a Muslim name. Until the name Muhammad, in Eastern Turkistan, they stopped prohibiting. Then he stopped using Muhammad name in Pakistan. Otherwise, he will just send out tweet and press releases with the name Muhammad and something else attached to it. So they adopt it. It's a in principle government. If they adopt by their own constitution and freedom, I think this problem would not have come to the level it has come. But they consistently have two faces. One face in which they deal with the real people, and one face for the outside world. That's why I will be stopped in the middle and somebody will recite the profession of faith for me. I'm not talking with him. He's just stopping me in the middle of the road to do that. And on the other time, I will be, when I'm talking to an imam, he will be harassed, and one person talking to me will be arrested. So this thing, I think, the fake Islam will continue to be limited to be there, as BBC and that Australian group has come up. There's 16,000 mosques has been destroyed, but some mosque, not only for a tourist attraction, but to showcase, has been maintained. Some of those places, their crescent from the top was taken out. It has been replaced now because they want to show it in a proper way.
Thank you very much. I'd like to remind the audience that we are taking questions. If you have any, you can just put them into the comment box on YouTube or Facebook, whatever platform you're watching on. Before moving on to the Q&A, perhaps we could talk a bit about the report's recommendations. How can different actors respond to what's happening in East Turkestan? Governments, faith leaders, NGOs, and so forth. Peter, perhaps you could start that discussion.
Sure, thanks, Nicole. We of course have recommendations for the Chinese government themselves, but maybe I'll just skip past that because I think the things that they need to do are fairly obvious from our perspective. Close the camp, stop detaining people arbitrarily, allow people to practice their faith. I think broadly speaking, the issue of religious repression is of course very much entangled with all of the other things that are happening in the region, whether it be mass detention or forced labor or any cultural repression in general. So what UHRP, of course, is advocating for, and we have for a number of years, is that the UN itself, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, for example, needs to be on this more forcefully. They need to start collecting information. The Chinese government has refused to access. They've claimed that they've said that they would allow access to UN investigators, that the High Commissioner herself needs to be actually doing their own kind of monitoring of the situation and come forward with a report. One issue that we run up against, I think, within the UN setting and with governments in general, is that one agency that we go to, for example, will say, look, well, we don't know anything about this because the UN Office, the High Commissioner has said nothing, and the ILO has said nothing, and this agency has said nothing, because no one is really willing to take this up. Well, the first thing that needs to be done from the top down is that there needs to be a report with findings from that office that actually will allow governments, for example, to take this information up. There is a sense, and this has to do with however you want to define it, the so-called Muslim world or Muslim majority states, for example, who have been mostly reluctant to speak about this at all. They are very happy to have a certain sense of possible deniability when the Chinese government comes out and has these shows and says that people are able to practice. This really helps these governments around the world. It helps the governments who are sort of either on the fence or clearly not going to speak out for Uyghurs. It helps them say, like, well, look, we see the stuff from Human Rights Watch or UHRP or from Uyghurs, but the Chinese government is also saying this. So we don't really know what to believe, right? So I think we need to undercut that, certainly with governments in general. So from the UN, and the UN would help with this if there is a report from their office, which we're still pushing for. With national governments, obviously they need to do their own investigations. You see investigations in the UK, hearings in Canada and the US and other places. This needs to increase to countries who are, again, more in the middle to do their own kind of research. Again, there's a political reluctance, of course, too, of criticizing China that I won't necessarily get into. You know, we all know why. But again, I think having a report like this, having information at our fingertips to say, look, to an Indonesia or Malaysia or a Turkey who perhaps might be a little bit reluctant to speak up on this, to say, look, here's information we have from the ground. Here are 1,000 Uyghur Imams who've been detained. Look, what do you have to say about this? You cannot keep saying that, look, the Chinese government is saying that everything's fine. No, it's not, because we keep piling on this information that exists. So I think the more we do that, the more it would help. Again, it's a civil society, more of a grassroots level. I think Malik has mentioned this too, is that there needs certainly to be certainly a refined strategy in terms of how we're approaching, again, the so-called Muslim world. There are people who would be concerned about a report like this. Like, how are we actually reaching them, whether it be foundationally having a report translated into Arabic or other languages in which these people are reading. It would help, of course, as well. Closely monitoring these developments from civil society themselves, so people sharing information with their supporters from different communities. I think sometimes we sit in these events, I find, and it's a bit of an echo chamber. We're all sort of saying these things, and we all understand what the recommendation should be and what should actually happen, but we need to break out of this sort of echo chamber to a certain extent to reach more people. Those are some of the recommendations that are in the report itself, but certainly I would welcome any comments from anybody else on this, where they sort of see this going.
Yes, perhaps Imam Malik has some recommendations that he would have for the governments of Muslim majority states or Muslim civil society around the world.
The challenge there, Nicole, is that what I have seen in the Muslim world media, people are still seeing it in the geopolitical context. America has a problem with China, which it does, and it is want to check China, and what disinformation is coming because of that. Now, there is no question about that America sees that as an opportunity and in its national interest to articulate human rights. But human rights situation in Eastern Turkestan is real. I mean, people just need to look around them. I mean, around the Kaaba in Mecca, there are shopkeepers. They call themselves Turkistani or Bukhari. They're actually Uyghurs. Nobody knows what Uyghur is in the Muslim world, but people know what Turkistani is, what Bukhari is. These are the same people. And somehow, there need to be groups in the Muslim countries, in the in the non-governmental format, who come up with their own reports based on their independent information, who could be facilitated by Justice for All or Uyghur Human Rights Project. And this is their own report, articulated by themselves. Indonesians have deep experience of this. Malaysians have experience of that. In Pakistan, there are Uyghurs who are living there for the last 50, 60, 70 years. So people know there are indigenous sources of information which need to be developed to be able to influence that their own government. I think that's the critical and crucial piece, because as long as things will be coming from the United States, it is very easy to brand that, okay, this is coming from America. America has an agenda about China, and people want to keep themselves a room. So liberating this issue of grave human rights concern from the geostrategic perspective itself is a task. So people see it as a human rights concern, ensuring that China, which has gone up and down, but always been bad in terms of religious freedom for Muslims, is put on a spot based on the independent sources. That is the challenge which I wonder about how to do that.
Thank you. Before we go to audience questions, Omar, I was wondering if you could tell us what do you think are the prospects of Turkey supporting Uyghurs in the coming years, especially because of the growing body of research on the conditions of Uyghurs on the ground in East Turkistan. Turkey, after all, is the home of one of the largest Uyghur diaspora populations, and so it's very important in doing research on conditions in the Uyghur homeland.
So yes, I think the perception that it's only a strategic, maybe competition between China and the U.S. in that context, and that's the maybe the U.S. conspiracy as it is changing, by recognized by the decisions of some governments, like parliaments in Canada, Netherlands, UK, Lithuania. This perception has been changing, and there is now a movement in the Muslim world, at least where, of course, the governments are still silent, but there are a lot of NGOs and influential people who are now speaking up and spoke up, in many different Muslim countries. It is also the trend in Turkey. I think in Turkey, although the government is passive and they didn't strongly spoken up, but there are opposition parties, opposite political parties. Their leaders are speaking up very strongly, and there is a very strong popular support in Turkey. So I think that if this trend goes on, and at the end, I hope that the Muslim majority countries also will be forced under the pressure of their popular pressure. They will speak up at the end, because now there is a lot of evidences. They don't. As Mr. Malik Mujahid indicated, there are independent reports by many independent research organizations, like Australia Strategic Policy Institute, and also UHRP, Human Rights Watch. This is there are already enough evidence to speak up, but because of their government's policy and Chinese government's pressure, economic and pressure on the Muslim countries, maybe they are still silent and not speaking up what's happening to the Uyghurs. But what's happening to the Uyghurs are actually a insult and also attack on the Muslim world, Muslim culture, Muslim traditions. So they are destroying our mosques. They are, even from the top leadership, they consider Islam as a disease that should be treated, accordingly. So this is, but even the Xi Jinping considered this, as a very dangerous, serious disease, and so therefore they are trying to to eliminate Islam, to destroy Islam. They have this. The Chinese authorities destroyed thousands of mosques. It's evidence. There are proof of that. According to Australia Strategic Policy Institute, 8,500 mosques have been destroyed. Totally destroyed since 2017. all these, evidences are available. So this is what lack is the will of the Islamic world to speak up, but it is changing now. With we have many Islamic organizations from Muslim countries, from Iraq, from Egypt, from Malaysia, from Indonesia. They are now approaching us, and we have already organized many webinars, to inform the people, to brief the academics or politicians what's happening to the Uyghurs. So this will, have some, result in the near future. I think they will speak up at the end, because everything, all the evidences are there. So we are not lying, as the Chinese say. This is even some of the Chinese, some, or even we get all these information, and the most important thing is this: China is not hiding what's happening. So they banned it is in their legislations, it is in their website. We got many of these pictures, images of this religious repression, and from Chinese sources, and we have leaked information from for example, the Karakash documents, also a example of that. So this is China will not be able to, although it is playing games, doing a lot of things to disinformation to fool the Islamic world, the international community. But as I said, the scope and scale of the repression is so huge that she will not be able to hide it. So at the end, international community and also Islamic world become more informed, and they will speak up. Yeah.
Thank you so much for those comments. We do have a couple of audience questions. Hilal Zoberi asked, is there any evidence of Hui imams detained? Hui are, of course, the Sinophone Muslim ethnic group who live across China, as well as in East Turkistan. I do know of one case that was reported by Bitter Winter, which had some sources on the ground who described Hui protesting the demolition of the mosque in their village and afterwards being all sent away to the camps. This is, of course, in contrast to a case in Gansu where Hui successfully halted the planned demolition of one of their mosques. So I do believe that Hui are being subjected to the comparatively repressive environment that exists in East Turkestan. But perhaps Abduali Ayub could tell us if he's heard of any cases of Hui imams being detained or sent to prison.
Yeah, we have. We have imams, Hui imam get arrested. Like in Urumqi, we have one imam get arrested because of he taught Quran to Uyghur kids. And we have a few imam got arrested in Gansu, Linsha. It's because of they recruited Uyghur students who are going to have a Quranic education. And mostly it's because of we are affiliated with the Uyghur imams or Uyghur religious leaders or recruited Uyghur students. We know these cases, yes.
I would like to share that I was interviewing some people who applied to work with our organizations in New York. And one of them was a Chinese fellow. I didn't know because of his name that he's a Muslim or not. But once he found out that it's a Muslim organization, we're a general human rights organization, but Muslim-based. He declined to accept our offer, telling me that last Ramadan, It was 2 years ago. Their home was invaded in the middle of night because mother and mother's sister were preparing to fast. And they asked them to stop and took away the Quran and the prayer rugs and things like that. And he declined to accept our job because he was afraid. So he told me that he's, Hui or Muslim of the Chinese heritage, and he has several other horrible stories to tell. He also told me that it happened to him despite the fact that his father works for the government, and intentionally they offer him things to eat during the Ramadan time, so to make sure that he's not fasting or practicing his faith. And he was not Uyghur. And then he said that if this could happen to me and my family, just imagine what is happening to Uyghur people. And he declined to accept our job.
We have one last question, time for one last question, also from Halal Zuberi. He asks if the detention campaign, the current crackdown, does it originate from Islamophobia, or is it ethnically targeted, part of an effort to ethnically cleanse Uyghurs? I think if any of our panelists could address that question.
Okay, I think it's depending on our research, we have Uyghur Imams. Like in China, there are more than 10 million Uyghur Muslim, Chinese-speaking Muslim, and we have a majority Uyghur-speaking Muslim in East Turkistan, and we have other Kazakh and Kyrgyz-speaking Muslim. And if we compare that, majority of them are Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims. Uyghur Muslim also targeted Uyghur Muslim Imams, but they targeted because of they recruited Uyghur students, and they affiliated with the Uyghur religious behavior. For example, that one of the Imam got arrested because of he participated Uyghur Quranic ceremony. In every Ramadan, we have a Quran Khatma. It means that complete Quran, and because of he participated that ceremony, and he got arrested. And from our research and the document we had, it is ethnic cleansing. It's not related to Islam. It is ethnic cleansing. And from my perspective, if Uyghur is not Muslim or Buddhist or Christian, it's the same. It doesn't matter which language, religion Uyghur practicing. Because of Uyghur practicing that religion, it unites Uyghur and it keep Uyghur culture alive, and it combined with the Uyghur culture. It will be the target of the Chinese government. So I think it's if it's the case that in Urumqi we have good comparison that Uyghur mosques destroyed because of its Uyghur style architect, and the Hui mosque still keep there its Chinese style architecture. The problem is in the same street, in the same place, the Uyghur mosque destroyed and the Hui mosque keep as original. It means that the target is not the mosque. Target is the construction. It's Uyghur style or Han Chinese style. In our Urumqi Hui mosque, Hui Muslims mosque is Han Chinese style mosque. Uyghur mosque is Central Asian style mosque. So from this mosque and from this ethnic group, we can find that it's the ethnic cleansing, not the Islamophobia. But Islamophobia, this element exists. It's because of Uyghur, not because of Islamophobia itself. Islamophobia is related to Uyghur. That's the reason, I think.
Yes. Yeah, I just want to add also to what Abdul Ali Ayub said. So China has not only targeted Uyghur religious people, but Uyghur intellectuals, Uyghurs who have been party members for 30 years. So the target is Uyghurs. Ethnic identity of the Uyghurs. So Islam, because the Islam is one of the foundational aspect of the Uyghur identity, so therefore they are also targeting Islam, because Uyghurs managed to keep their identity by sticking to Islam. So therefore they see the Islam also one of the foundational aspect of the Uyghur identity. So therefore they are also targeting Islam as well. Islam as well, yeah. So but the main target here, I think, is the Uyghur ethnicity. Yes, Uyghurs are being targeted or being put in concentration camps or detained on sentenced to a long time imprisonment because they were Uyghurs, because they are Uyghurs, because of their Uyghur identity. But of course, Islam is very connected to the Uyghur identity as well. So a part of the very important part of the Uyghur identity. So it is a mainly they are targeting actually Uyghur ethnicity. Yeah.
That's about, we've gone slightly over time. I don't know if anyone has any closing remarks that they would like to make.
Can I add something?
Yes.
This time, like, we didn't put the Uyghur female religious figures inside. Mainly it's because of it's hard to identify. Like Uyghur male imams, we can identify through government websites. We can find their name, and if they're information deleted, and we confirm that one got arrested. But the female, there is Xinjiang Islamic Association and local Islamic associations and the Islamic schools. Xinjiang Islamic Institute, there is no Uyghur female students. There is no Uyghur female professors. And the local associations, and there is no Uyghur female scholars or female government officials. So it's really hard to identify because there is no official evidence to verify that they disappeared, got arrested. Another thing that those Uyghur religious figures, they are not very how can I say, they're not very obvious in the society. They always do their job secretly. So it's really hard to find out the evidence about them. Third, and it's because most of them persecuted, but their Uyghur this time escaped to outside. Most of them are male. Female stayed in East Turkistan. So it's really hard to gather evidence about them. But we have some evidence, and we have some figures, and it's about until now I identified 13 Uyghur female religious leaders. They got arrested and sentenced. But about their story and about their persecution, we need to go further. And so I hope it will get attention, and we will do the job continuously. And because of half of Uyghur are female, and we shouldn't neglect their cases, and we will do it in the future.
Thank you so much. If no one has anything else to add, Joanne Smith-Finley.
Yeah, I would just add that, yeah, I agree. This is not about Islam per se. This is about a perceived disloyal group, perceived in the eyes of the state to be potentially disloyal, potentially separatist, to have potentially aspirations to independence in a very important part of the Chinese nation that is going to be central for the Belt and Road Initiative. So if you look at state discourses, I've been analysing PRC state discourses, and they talk about the need for thought liberation, liberating the masses from Islamic extremist thoughts. And in those discourses are really, really very frightening. They talk about sweeping the very religious, the very pious Uyghurs into the grave of history. That's a direct quote from one document I've read. We will sweep those Uyghurs into the grave of history. And elsewhere in the document, it talks about how those pious Uyghurs, if they were left unattended, would cultivate the next generation of poisonous grasses. And poisonous grasses is a cultural revolution term, for disloyal citizens who would go against the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese Communist Party policy. So it's about perceived disloyalty, and it's all the more ironic in that, when I first went to the Uyghur region in the mid-1990s, yes, some young men, a few young hotheads talked about the potential for independence from China, but most people, certainly the women and the older people, didn't aspire to independence. They were looking for equality and dignity and justice within the existing system. And the irony of what's happening now over the last few years is that I can't imagine that any Uyghur, either in the Uyghur region or outside of the Uyghur region, can see any alternative now to full independence. That must, that has to be seen now as the only possibility for Uyghurs to be able to live their cultural and religious lives in full, as Muslims everywhere else in the world do.
I agree with this whole point which you made and Omar Kanat also made. This is absolutely correct, the identity of Uyghur. But in the Chinese media, there is growing information which is sort of Islamophobic, independent of that. And a statement which they make about Islam and things of this nature in some of the purely Chinese population areas outside Eastern Turkistan. In some of the bazaar, they have some Islamic symbolism which has been taken out, and information about halal restaurant is also eliminated. So it seems that whatever they're doing in Eastern Turkestan is being to a far lesser level, is being used in other part and contributing to Islamophobia. It seems it is a sort of a self-reinforcing type of thing which is happening. I have read reports here and there, but nobody has dedicated a report on Islamophobia in China itself. So that probably does contribute to the growing power of China, that there was a time when China was one of the major exporter of halal product, selling to the Muslim world, selling the kufis and the prayer rugs to the Muslim world. That China seems to have left that past behind, and they do contribute to misinformation about Islam, sometimes picking up from the leading Islamophobes in America and putting that. So hopefully, some independent research will take place, what China overall is doing vis-a-vis when it comes to this Islamic, its understanding of Islam, and realizing that a general hate towards Islam, which after 9/11 found a major industry, is something different, and they are able to check that as well.
I think there is definitely a coinciding strain of Islamophobia growing in Han Chinese society for sure, and encouraged by the government's actions in the Uyghur region. I have a Han Chinese anonymous person who's been contacting me from Wuhan, who has been sending me pictures of halal signage on Hui restaurants in Wuhan being scrubbed out, covered over with wooden planks, in the same way that I observed in the Uyghur region in 2018 when I was there last. I have hundreds of photographs of, mosques covered in deserted mosques covered with barbed wire, halal restaurants with the halal signage scrubbed out and torn off, and so on. The Aitkar Mosque with the Arabic calligraphy torn off. But these practices are beginning to spread to other areas of China and to Hui communities in other parts of China, which shows that while the Uyghurs are being targeted for their ethnicity and not for Islam, that very targeting is having a knock-on effect for Muslim communities all across China.
Thank you so much for those comments. With that, we should probably close the event. We've gone a little bit over time, but I want to thank you so much for all of your comments, and I want to thank the audience for their attention. We hope that you will take the time to read the report if you've not done so already, since it does go into even more detail than we've been able to discuss here today. With that, thank you once again for joining us, and be sure to join our mailing list or follow us on social media to find out about future events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.